The Intergalactic Academy stood at the very heart of the Zyrath system, a massive floating structure orbiting a dying star. It was a place where only the brightest minds from every known civilization came to study, a place where knowledge transcended the limitations of single species. For centuries, the Academy had been the proving ground for the most advanced scientific minds across the galaxy. Those who entered left as legends, their names carved into the history of their respective civilizations. On this particular day, students from every corner of the universe gathered in the Great Lecture Hall, a vast chamber with tiered seating that stretched endlessly into the dark, crystalline walls. Hovering holoscreens projected the faces of hundreds of students who attended remotely from their home planets, their forms flickering in digital translucency. The air was filled with the low hum of whispered conversations, the buzzing of various energy sources, and the subtle sound of alien breathing patterns, some rhythmic, some erratic, some resembling the churning of molten rock. Roger Price sat alone near the back, his chair barely accommodating his form among the much larger students of other species. As the only human in the room, he had learned to tune out the quiet but ever-present stares. He wasn't the tallest, nor the strongest, nor the fastest. Compared to the intellectual powerhouses of the galaxy, he was just an anomaly, a small, fragile being from a war-torn planet that had only recently made contact with the greater universe. The others saw him as an outlier, a curiosity at best, a mistake at worst. A deep, vibrating tone echoed through the hall as Professor Zyphar entered, floating several feet above the ground, his elongated form shifting in an iridescent shimmer of colors. The Zyrath's professor had no eyes, no mouth, no features that resembled anything human, yet his presence commanded absolute attention. His species communicated through direct neural transmissions, bypassing sound altogether, yet today, for the sake of the diverse student body, he chose to speak aloud in galactic common. His voice was a chorus of overlapping tones, ancient and vast, as though 100 minds were speaking in unison. "The challenge before you," he began, his voice carrying a weight that silenced even the most restless of students, "is the foundation of all civilizations. It is what separates the primitive from the advanced, the stagnant from the evolving. Energy." A massive hologram materialized above the hall, displaying the swirling core of a neutron star, its gravitational forces bending the very fabric of space. Data scrolled alongside the projection, intricate equations that detailed the incomprehensible power of cosmic forces. Some students leaned forward, eager to absorb every bit of information, while others sat still, their expressions unreadable. Professor Zyphar continued, his form pulsating slightly with each word. "You will each be tasked with creating a self-sustaining energy source, one capable of fueling an entire civilization indefinitely. Your deadline is 1 month. You may use any known materials, any theories, any technologies at your disposal. There are no restrictions, only the expectation that your creation must work." Excited murmurs filled the hall. This was no ordinary assignment. This was a test that would define their futures. The greatest minds of the known universe had struggled for centuries to perfect energy stability, and now a room full of students was expected to solve it in mere weeks. Roger felt a slight twinge of nervousness as he listened to the professor's words. He wasn't afraid of the challenge itself, he had always been good at problem solving, but he knew exactly how this would play out. The other students would dismiss him immediately, forming groups that excluded him entirely. It had happened before in previous assignments. The hierarchy of intelligence was unspoken but universally understood. The oldest, most advanced races worked together, forming alliances that had existed for millennia. The younger, less evolved species banded together in lower-tier groups. And then there was Roger, humanity's only representative, left to work alone. He watched as the room immediately burst into motion. Alien students rushed to their respective groups, engaging in rapid discussions, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony of languages. Some races spoke in harmonized frequencies, others in deep, guttural vibrations. A few didn't speak at all, communicating through gestures, neural links, or bioluminescent flashes. The sheer variety of thought processes was staggering. Across the room, a towering Zelvra, a species known for their crystalline neural structures, was already running calculations through a holographic display, his hands moving so fast they blurred. A trio of Velkarns, whose species had mastered dark matter manipulation, discussed how to harness quantum singularities. A group of Keltherans debated the merits of constructing a miniature Dyson sphere. Every team had a plan, every group had a theory, and every mind was set on proving their superiority. No one approached Roger. He wasn't surprised. It was always like this. Letting out a quiet sigh, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the frantic energy around him. He could already tell what the others would do. They would overcomplicate the problem, layering theories upon theories, chasing the most advanced, the most groundbreaking, the most impressive solution. They would strive to outdo each other, pushing the boundaries of physics, ignoring the simple truth that had been humanity's greatest advantage since the dawn of time: efficiency. Roger opened his eyes and exhaled slowly. He had an idea, one so simple that none of the others would ever consider it, but he wasn't going to share it yet. He stood up, stretching his arms before casually walking toward the exit. A few students glanced at him, some amused, some indifferent. One of the Velkarans smirked, his dark, glossy skin shifting slightly as he whispered something to his companions. Giving up already, human? Roger didn't stop walking. He had no interest in arguing. He had work to do. As the heavy doors slid shut behind him, the last thing he heard was Professor Zyfar's voice, resonating through the hall like an echo across time. You have 1 month. Prove to the universe that you are worthy of its knowledge. Roger stepped into the Academy's research wing, a vast labyrinth of labs, workshops, and experimental chambers filled with students working tirelessly on their projects. The air vibrated with energy from advanced machinery, the soft hum of quantum processors, and the occasional burst of light from matter conversion experiments. The walls pulsed with faint blue circuits, reacting to the neural interfaces of the Zyrath's designed infrastructure. Every inch of the facility radiated pure intellect, an environment where only the most brilliant could thrive. He walked past a transparent observation deck, looking down at several groups working with synchronized precision. The Kelterans were using their unique ability to manipulate energy fields, crafting a structure that resembled a miniature star encased in a pulsating containment field. The Velkarans, always obsessed with extremes, were experimenting with controlled singularities, harnessing the sheer force of a micro-black hole. Other species worked with cold fusion, quantum stabilization, and methods so advanced that even the Academy's own system struggled to model them accurately. Roger knew what was happening. Each group was trying to outdo the other, pushing the boundaries of their respective scientific fields to prove superiority. It was a contest of brilliance, not practicality. He had no doubt that some of them would produce impressive results, but he also knew that the more complicated a system became, the greater the likelihood of failure. He had seen it too many times before. Great minds lost in their own complexity, forgetting that the best solutions were often the simplest. He reached his assigned workspace, a compact lab with standard equipment, a workbench, a universal fabricator, and a console linked to the Academy's research network. It was a fraction of what the others had access to, but he preferred it that way. He had never relied on endless resources or sophisticated technology. What he needed was a plan, and he already had one forming in his mind. Pulling up a holographic interface, he began sifting through the Academy's vast database of research materials. The key to his project wasn't raw power, but sustainability. Most civilizations in the galaxy relied on massive energy infrastructures, complex grids, and fragile stabilization systems. He needed to create something fundamentally different, something that worked, because it embraced the natural flow of energy rather than fighting against it. He skimmed through records of past failures, looking for patterns. Nearly every advanced energy project collapsed under its own ambition. Unstable plasma reactors, antimatter containment breaches, unpredictable quantum fluctuations. The failures weren't due to lack of intelligence, but rather an unwillingness to accept that sometimes less was more. The door to his lab slid open, and a figure stepped inside. Roger turned his head slightly, already expecting the interruption. It was Rylan, one of the Zyrath researchers who worked closely with Professor Zyphar. Unlike the other students, Rylan had no need for spoken words. He communicated through direct neural transmissions, his thoughts forming a clear pulse in Roger's mind. "You are not collaborating with any of the groups," Rylan stated, his voice an echo inside Roger's head. An unusual choice. Roger didn't look up from his interface. "I work better alone." Rylan's presence flickered with curiosity. "Humanity has a reputation for collective problem-solving. Your species thrives on collaboration. Why reject it?" Roger smirked, tapping a few commands to bring up an energy projection model. "Because when too many people try to solve a problem, they stop looking for the simplest answer. They get caught up in proving how smart they are instead of just making something that works." Rylan considered his words for a moment. "You believe the others are overcomplicating the challenge?" Roger leaned back against the workbench, folding his arms. "I don't believe it. I know it." Rylan's form shifted slightly, his bioluminescent core pulsing in thought. "And what is your approach?" Roger glanced at the projection model, watching as his preliminary calculations began to take shape. "Harnessing energy isn't the hard part. The hard part is stabilizing it without needing endless infrastructure. Everyone else is trying to reinvent the universe. I'm just going to let it do what it already does naturally." Rylan remained silent for several seconds. The Zyraths were not known for emotion, but Roger could sense something akin to amusement in his presence. Finally, Rylan's form flickered once before he turned toward the door. "I will be watching your progress, human." As the door slid shut behind him, Roger turned back to his work. He had no interest in impressing anyone, least of all the Zyrath researchers. All he cared about was proving his point. He activated the fabrication unit, inputting the parameters for his first prototype. Unlike the others, he didn't need exotic materials or impossible equations. He needed something small, something self-sustaining, something that could generate power not through brute force, but through balance. The blueprint unfolded in front of him, a simple core designed to mimic the natural energy transfer processes that already existed in the universe. He wasn't going to build an artificial reactor or a fusion containment chamber. He was going to create something that functioned the way a star functioned, something that didn't fight the laws of physics, but worked with them. It was a radical idea, but it wasn't impossible. And if he was right, he wasn't going to need a month. He was going to need a single night. Roger barely glanced up as the fabrication unit whirred to life, its sleek metallic arms moving with fluid precision. The machine hummed, rearranging molecular structures with each calculated motion, layering the necessary components for his prototype. He leaned against the console, watching as the design he had formulated in his mind now took shape in front of him. It was one thing to sketch a concept, another to see it come alive. He had no doubt that the others were still deep in theoretical debates, but he had already moved past that phase. He worked best with his hands, and now the real test began. The room was dimly lit, except for the projection hovering above his workstation, its data streams shifting in real time as the fabrication process continued. The model he had designed wasn't like anything the other students were building. They were all focused on high energy output, on harnessing power through brute force, on containment fields and stabilization grids. He wasn't interested in any of that. His prototype would operate on equilibrium, a natural flow of energy rather than a controlled one. That was what everyone else failed to understand. Energy didn't need to be forced into submission. It only needed the right conditions to sustain itself. The fabrication unit finished assembling the first core, a compact structure no larger than his palm. It was smooth, dark, and unremarkable at first glance, but the moment he activated it, the entire lab reacted. A low, steady pulse resonated through the room, subtle but undeniable. The holographic readings fluctuated for a second before stabilizing, confirming what he already suspected. The core was drawing ambient energy from the surrounding environment, refining it and outputting a perfectly balanced stream of power. Roger exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he studied the readings. The numbers didn't lie. His prototype was working exactly as intended. The energy output was steady, sustainable, and, most importantly, self-regulating. No overheating, no unstable reactions, no need for an external containment field. It was simple, efficient, and scalable. He could already see how it could be adapted for larger systems, for entire planetary infrastructures. But this was just the first step. He adjusted the interface, increasing the load gradually, testing the limits of the core. It responded flawlessly, adapting to the changes without any strain. His fingers hovered over the console for a brief moment before he pushed it even further, bypassing the standard safety limits set by the Academy's systems. The holographic display flickered as new data streamed in, showing efficiency levels that should have been impossible. A normal energy source would have collapsed under the increasing demand. His didn't. Instead, it absorbed the excess load, redistributing it smoothly, as if the strain didn't exist at all. His lips twitched into the faintest of smirks. It worked, but now he needed to refine it further. This was only a prototype, a proof of concept. If he was going to make his final design undeniable, it needed to be more than just functional. It needed to be elegant in its simplicity, undeniable in its superiority. He shut the system down and reached for his tools. There was no point in waiting. He had the foundation now. It was time to perfect it. Time passed unnoticed as he worked, dismantling, refining, reassembling. Every adjustment brought the core closer to his vision, smoothing out inefficiencies, optimizing every component. The lab remained eerily silent except for the occasional hiss of the fabricator and the rhythmic tapping of his fingers against the interface. At some point he realized he wasn't alone. The presence was subtle at first, an almost imperceptible shift in the air. Roger didn't pause in his work, but he was aware of the eyes watching him, studying his every movement. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Rylan, the Zyrath researcher, had entered the lab without a sound, his bioluminescent form casting faint reflections against the metallic surfaces. He made no move to interrupt, no attempt to announce his presence, but Roger could feel the weight of his observation. "Your progress is unexpected." Rylan's voice resonated in his mind, his telepathic tone devoid of any emotion, yet layered with curiosity. Roger didn't look up from the adjustments he was making. "Unexpected?" he echoed, his tone dry. "Or inconvenient?" Rylan's form flickered slightly, the equivalent of a subtle shift in expression for his species. "You assume your success challenges something." Roger finally set his tools down, turning his attention to the Zyraths. "Doesn't it?" Rylan studied him in silence for a moment before responding. "You misunderstand the purpose of this challenge. It is not meant to be won. It is meant to be explored." Roger leaned back against the workbench, folding his arms. "That's the problem, isn't it? Everyone else is so busy exploring that they forgot the goal was to actually solve it." The Zyrath tilted his head slightly, the glow of his form shifting in faint pulses. "You believe you have solved it?" Roger gestured toward the core, still faintly humming with its steady energy output. "You tell me." Rylan stepped closer, examining the device. Roger watched as the Zyrath's neural interface connected with the lab's systems, scanning the readings. He knew what the data would show. No flaws, no waste, no instability. Finally, Rylan's glow pulsed once more. You have achieved something most considered improbable. Roger shrugged. I get that a lot. Ryland's gaze remained fixed on the core. And yet, you are not finished. Roger smirked. Perfection takes time. Ryland was silent for a long moment before finally turning toward the exit. Perhaps you are not as misplaced in this academy as some believe. Roger watched as he left, the doors sliding shut behind him. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders before turning back to his work. The prototype was functioning. The Zyraths knew it. But it wasn't enough. He wasn't just going to prove that his design worked. He was going to make sure it could never be ignored. Roger barely noticed the passing hours as he worked. His focus was absolute, his hands moving with practiced precision as he refined the core's design. He wasn't just making adjustments, he was perfecting every aspect of the system. The initial prototype had proven that his concept worked, but now he needed to push it beyond theoretical success. It had to be flawless. It had to be undeniable. The core sat in the center of the workbench, its dark surface pulsing with a steady, rhythmic glow. The energy output was smooth, controlled, and sustainable, but he knew it could be better. He tapped a few commands into the console, pulling up a holographic projection of the energy distribution matrix. There was still a slight inefficiency, something microscopic, but enough to bother him. He exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders before reaching for his tools. His fingers moved automatically, dismantling the casing and exposing the intricate lattice of energy conduits within. The design was compact, deliberately minimalistic, but even simplicity had room for improvement. He adjusted the alignment of the internal regulators, fine-tuning the way the core processed ambient energy. It was delicate work, but he thrived on precision. The room remained silent except for the occasional hum of the equipment. He preferred it that way. Distractions only slowed him down. A notification flickered across the console, a system alert indicating that external monitoring had been activated. Roger's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't need to check to know who was watching. The Zyraths weren't subtle when they wanted to observe something closely. He ignored it. If Rylan or anyone else wanted to watch, let them. He wasn't doing this for them. He initiated another test, feeding controlled variations into the core's energy intake. The adjustments responded perfectly, stabilizing even faster than before. The efficiency rating climbed higher, edging toward an almost impossible level of optimization. He leaned back slightly, studying the new data with a sharp eye. Better. Not perfect yet, but better. His fingers hovered over the console, considering his next step. The theoretical limitations had already been shattered, but there was still one thing left to test: the stress threshold. If this design was truly superior, it had to withstand extreme conditions. It couldn't just work under ideal circumstances. It had to endure unpredictability. He increased the energy load incrementally, monitoring the core's response. The readings remained stable. He pushed it further, doubling the expected output. No change. The core adapted seamlessly, absorbing the excess and redistributing it without issue. He felt a slow, satisfied smirk forming, but he wasn't done yet. One more step. He bypassed the final safety protocols, setting the energy influx to its theoretical maximum. If the system failed, this was where it would happen. The core flared, its glow intensifying as it absorbed the overwhelming energy input. For a brief second, the entire lab pulsed with residual energy, the consoles flickering under the surge. Roger narrowed his eyes, watching as the data scrolled in rapid succession. No failure, no instability. The system had adapted. His smirk widened. It worked. Not just as a concept, not just in controlled tests, but in real conditions, under extreme pressure. This wasn't just a functioning design. This was something new. He shut the system down, exhaling slowly as the core dimmed to its resting state. The lab was silent again, the air charged with the lingering energy of what had just happened. A sharp chime broke the stillness, signaling an incoming communication. He glanced at the console, unsurprised to see the source. Ryland. He considered ignoring it, but after a brief moment, he accepted the connection. The Zyrath's voice entered his mind with its usual calm neutrality. Your experiment exceeded projected limitations. Roger leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms. I know. Pause. Your methods are unconventional. Roger smirked slightly. That's the polite way of saying reckless, isn't it? Ryland didn't acknowledge the remark. Professor Zyphar has taken interest. Roger's smirk faded slightly. He had expected scrutiny, but Zyphar personally paying attention meant things were shifting faster than he anticipated. He tilted his head slightly. And what does that mean? Ryland's form pulsed once. It means your progress will not remain unnoticed. Roger exhaled through his nose. He had never cared for attention, but he had known from the moment he started this project that it would lead somewhere he couldn't avoid. He pushed off the workbench, straightening. Let them watch. The work speaks for itself. Ryland didn't respond immediately. When he did, there was a hint of something almost resembling amusement. It does indeed. The connection ended and Roger was left alone once more. He turned back to the core, studying it in the dim light. There was only one thing left to do, the final test. And when that was done, there would be no more questions, no more doubts. Just results. Roger stood in the dim glow of the lab, staring at the core as it pulsed with a steady, controlled rhythm. It was stable, efficient, and powerful beyond anything the Academy had ever seen. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. The final test loomed before him, the one that would either confirm his success or destroy everything he had built. He had pushed the core to its theoretical limits, but theory wasn't proof. Theory could always be debated, argued against, dismissed. He needed something undeniable, something that even Professor Zyphar, even the entire Academy, couldn't ignore. He reached for the console, his fingers hovering over the control panel as he set the parameters for the last phase of testing. If the core could handle this, it could handle anything. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. No hesitation, no second-guessing. He activated the simulation. Instantly, the lab was bathed in a harsh electric glow as the environmental systems adjusted to the new conditions. The temperature dropped, the air pressure shifted, and the artificial gravity fluctuated to simulate extreme planetary environments. The holographic interface displayed a range of increasingly hostile conditions. Deep space vacuum, high radiation atmospheres, magnetic storms, each one more brutal than the last. Roger kept his eyes on the core, monitoring its response. The energy readings remained stable, the output adapting to every environmental change without disruption. He pushed it further, amplifying the energy drain, introducing unpredictable variables. If there was a weakness, this would expose it. The core pulsed, shifting seamlessly to compensate. His lips pressed into a thin line. It was working. Perfectly. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, watching the data stream in endless waves across the console. Minutes, hours, it didn't matter. The test continued, and the core held. Then, the final phase. Roger keyed in the last command, and the chamber's parameters shifted once more. This time, there were no gradual changes, no controlled increments. This was a direct overload, an attempt to force the core into failure by pushing it beyond anything it was designed to handle. He didn't ease into it. He didn't give it time to adapt. He threw everything at it at once. For a split second, the room flashed white. The consoles flickered, the air crackled with residual energy, and the floor trembled under the force of the overload. Roger narrowed his eyes, ignoring the alarms blaring through the lab. He knew what he was looking for. If the core collapsed, even for a moment, then it wasn't ready. But if it survived this, the light faded, the system stabilized, and the alarms cut out one by one. Roger let out a slow breath. The core remained intact. Not just intact, stronger. He turned back to the console, scanning the final data set. It had not only absorbed the overload, but had optimized its own energy flow and response. It had adapted, evolved, There was no instability, no loss of control, just pure, self-sustaining energy. A quiet exhale escaped him. That was it, the proof. The final, undeniable confirmation that he had done what no one else had. Before he could fully process it, a new notification appeared on his screen. A priority override. He stiffened slightly, recognizing the access code immediately. Professor Zyrath. Roger's jaw tightened as he keyed in the authorization. The lab's communication display shifted, and the towering, iridescent form of the Zyrath professor materialized in front of him, his bioluminescent patterns shifting in slow, unreadable pulses. His presence filled the room, a weight that pressed against the very air. Roger Price. Zyrath's voice resonated, a layered chorus of tones vibrating through the lab. You have forced our attention. Roger met the professor's gaze, his posture steady. He wasn't intimidated, not now. I assume that means you've seen the results. Zyrath studied him for a long, silent moment. The pulsing light of his form flickered, shifting in ways Roger couldn't decipher. Finally, the professor spoke again. We expected theory, we did not expect this. Roger arched a brow. Didn't expect what? That it would work? A faint shift in Zyrath's glow. That it would work so well. Silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Roger could feel the weight of the moment pressing down, the realization settling in. He had done something that even the Zyraths hadn't anticipated. That was rare. You are aware of what this means, Zyrath continued, his voice measured, controlled. This is no longer an academic exercise. Roger's fingers curled slightly against the console. He knew exactly what the professor meant. This wasn't just a project anymore. This wasn't just a challenge issued to students for intellectual stimulation. What he had created, what he had proven, changed everything. A limitless, self-sustaining energy source, a system that could power entire civilizations without resource depletion, without reliance on unstable technologies. The implications were staggering. The political ramifications alone would be enough to shake entire star systems. The energy monopolies, the existing power structures. None of them would remain untouched if this technology was unleashed. There were forces in the galaxy that would not welcome this kind of advancement. Roger held Zyrath's gaze. I didn't build this to keep it locked away. Zyrath remained silent for a long moment before responding. Then you must be prepared for what comes next. Roger exhaled, steadying himself. He had known from the beginning that this wouldn't end in a simple academic evaluation, but hearing it confirmed by Zyrath himself made it feel more real. He wasn't just a student anymore. He was holding something that could change the galaxy. The Zyrath professor's glow shifted slightly, his form pulsing with unreadable patterns. You will not face this alone. Roger's brow furrowed slightly, surprised by the words. He had expected resistance, skepticism, maybe even a warning to abandon the project before it drew the wrong kind of attention. But this? Zyrath continued, his voice carrying a weight that resonated beyond the spoken words. The Academy will not ignore progress, nor will it suppress it. What you have built will be tested, refined, and prepared for the consequences that follow. Roger let the words settle before nodding once. He had never needed validation, but knowing that at least some part of the academic world wouldn't turn against him meant he had a foundation to stand on. The connection ended, and the hologram dissolved into nothing. Roger stood there for a long moment, staring at the space where Zyrath had been. He could feel the shift in the air, the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The test was over. Now, the real challenge began.